Out of the B-movie sci-fi boom of the early 50s came Donovan's Brain, an indie flick in which a brain in a fish tank takes control of a scientist and makes him commit tax fraud. You'd be forgiven for thinking I'm about to launch into another rousing defense of the kind of schlock you'd find on MST3K, but Donovan's Brain isn't that schlocky. Believe it or not, it's a pretty solid film that is far better than it has any right to be, having landed a humble place in cinema history as an easily overlooked gem of the era. So today, I'm not only going to tell you how this movie came to be and why it should be remembered, but I'll also answer the time-honored Hollywood question: does this movie deserve a remake?
Dr. Corey and his wife Janice are two medical scientists living secluded lives in their mountain retreat, where they are free to pursue experiments that others might consider unethical. However, their peace is shattered when a plane crashes nearby and Dr. Corey is forced to attempt to save the twisted form of Warren Donovan, a world-famous millionaire. But as Donovan's body lay dying in his laboratory, Corey then extracts his brain to prove whether or not it can survive on the outside, and to his credit, it does. Keeping this medical miracle a secret for the time being, Corey attempts to communicate with Donovan, only to slowly succumb to the brain's psychic influence. The line between Corey and Donovan blurs beyond recognition, and soon they will battle for supremacy.
After fleeing Germany in the lead-up to World War II, the Jewish-born writer Kurt Siodmak looked for work in Hollywood. He managed to find a job at Universal Pictures, working on screenplays for films like The Wolfman, The Invisible Man Returns, and Black Friday, the latter of which features a plot involving a partial brain transplant. In 1942, no doubt inspired by Black Friday, Siodmak published the novel Donovan's Brain, a wildly successful book that was printed off for US military personnel during the war. It's notable for its dark, almost cynical themes, and for taking a hard science fiction approach to the seemingly ludicrous idea of a telepathic disembodied brain. In addition to being adapted for radio by Orson Welles, Donovan's Brain was loosely translated to the screen in 1944 as The Lady and the Monster, a decent but flawed little thriller whose biggest highlight is Erich von Stroheim playing a mad scientist. Let me know in the comments if you want me to cover it in more detail in the future, and I'll see about getting my hands on a copy. Anyway, a few years after The Lady and the Monster, another adaptation began under the stewardship of the new independent film production company Alan Dowling Productions and producer Tom Grise. Kurt Siodmak himself was originally tapped to direct the film, but tensions between the writer and producer rose to the point that Siodmak was given a check and sent on his way, to be quickly replaced by Felix E. Feist, who I've mentioned before in relation to his post-apocalyptic disaster film Deluge. This new version of Donovan's Brain, adapted by Hugh Brook and Feist himself, does stick closer to the novel than its predecessor, and its successors, but I'll talk about them later. However, it changes a few details, slightly alters the ending, and radically switches the protagonist, Dr. Corey, from an all-around awful human being to a warm-hearted guy lost in his work. This episode was voted on by my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to vote on future topics like this one, get early ad-free versions of my videos, or just wish to help keep this channel viable as YouTube ad revenue gets increasingly stingy and the copyright bots get increasingly hostile, please consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. I'd like to give a special shout out to my $8 patrons: Batty Bat Firebrand, Chuck Poor, Diane McGill Davis, Don Quixote, Given Chumley DDF, Jack Blair, John Burrell, Mike O'Connor, Numinous 2019, Patrick Baker, Robert McGill, Sean Vale, Spodes, TB Schrammick, Tracy Rothmyers, and Warren Davis. Thank you so much for your support. To play Dr. Corey, they hired veteran character actor Lou Ayres, in part due to the actor's low asking price. He served in World War II as a combat medic, but his registry as a conscientious objector cost him a lot of clout in Hollywood, leading to difficulties landing high-profile roles and ultimately resulting in him making the switch to television, where he'd wind up becoming president of the galaxy.
Well, surely you don't cling to your suspicions about the Cylons. They asked for this armistice. They want peace.
Ayers is good in the role of Dr. Corey, but when he has to switch to the Mr. Hyde-like Donovan, you can nearly see the limits of his range. Dr. Corey's wife, Janice, is played by future First Lady Nancy Reagan, still using her stepfather's surname as Nancy Davis. While I'm not going to try to convince you that Nancy Reagan was a world-class actress, she wasn't, her performance as Janice is pretty good, though it's a shame her character isn't given enough to do. Reagan, like Ayers, transitioned to television shortly after Donovan's Brain and quit acting altogether once her husband ran for governor of California in the 60s. Other notable actors include Gene Evans as Dr. Schratt, Steve Brody as Yoakum, Tom Powers as Donovan's Washington advisor, and John Hamilton, as the bank manager. Filming began in mid-February 1953 at the incredibly generic-sounding Motion Picture Center Studios, which would later become Desilu Studios and is now Red Studios Hollywood. Under the direction of noir veteran Felix Feist and cinematographer Joseph Byrock, the movie is shot more like a film noir than a science fiction film, something that also extends to the music composed by Eddie Dunstedter. As for the primary special effect, the titular brain, it was designed and built by Harry Redmond Jr., who had previously worked on the original King Kong and The Last Days of Pompeii, and also contributed to the effects in Kurt Siodmak's The Magnetic Monster the same year as Donovan's Brain. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the brain is pretty goofy looking to modern eyes, but as brains in a vat go, there are far worse examples out there. Trust me. I think the other props around the brain help to sell it, as the movie doesn't resort to the typical mad scientist gear of the era, and instead opts for equipment that looks more realistic and subdued. But let's not kid ourselves, how believable can you really make a pulsating brain in a fish tank? Donovan's Brain released in late September of 1953 to mixed reviews from critics. Ayers was seen as a standout performer, and the film was generally considered better than the novel's previous adaptation, but few seemed to think it deserved to be elevated above B-movie status. That said, it has maintained a cult reputation since its release, and remains a fixture in classic sci-fi movie circles, still featured by the likes of TCM and Pluto TV. Meanwhile, the novel has been adapted 2 more times, once on television for CBS's Studio One, and again on film as the British/West German adaptation Vengeance, later renamed simply The Brain. I can't claim to have seen either, but according to most reports, they are inferior to the 1953 adaptation. And that leads me back to the question I started with. Should Donovan's Brain get another more modern remake? As regular viewers of this channel know, my criteria for remakes are simple. A movie is ripe for a remake if it is built around a good idea with a lot of potential that wasn't fully met. While Donovan's Brain the movie leans into the well-worn split personality trope, the novel spends more time drawing parallels between the ruthless businessman and the obsessed scientist, demonstrating how easily a man can lose his humanity regardless of the nobility of his cause. I grant that it is trickier in film to sell an unlikable protagonist, but I do believe it is possible, in a remake, to show Dr. Corey as a lost soul who slowly comes to realize he is no better than an unscrupulous swindler, without making audiences hate him. Walking this line could make for a fascinating psychological horror story that avoids falling into either Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde. Besides, as much as I like 1953's Donovan's Brain, it is a flawed film for a couple of reasons. Like the book, it feels like 2 different stories competing for attention, which, given the nature of the plot, is a bit fitting, but the opening of the film spends so much time setting up Dr. Corey, Janice, and Dr. Schratt that by the time we finally get a peek into the sordid affairs of Warren Donovan in the city, it seems like an extended and pointless digression that doesn't move forward the story of the characters we care about. It also suffers because the financial scheme that dominates the second act is absurdly convoluted and incomprehensible to the average viewer. And on top of that, it doesn't get satisfactorily resolved by the end of the movie. There are also a few places in the movie where it feels like we've missed a few scenes. For example, early on, Dr. Corey and Dr. Schratt have a conversation about how schizophrenic Corey has become, followed by Schratt and Janice lamenting the same, but prior to these moments, we hadn't really seen them interact with the Donovan-possessed Corey or noticed any adverse effects on their relationships. Another good example is the lightning rod, mentioned fleetingly in a tape recording, but then hidden from the plot until the very end, when it acts as a critical MacGuffin that is so underdeveloped it feels like a Deus Ex Machina. So yes, Donovan's Brain is definitely ripe for a remake, but I don't want to end the video with the impression that it is a bad movie, because it isn't. Sure, it wears its independent production values on its sleeve, but that's part of its lasting charm, held up by solid acting, tightly written dialogue, and a pervasive sense of dread. I love that it feels more like a film noir than a science fiction film, and it is classier than your average 50s B-movie about a mind-controlling brain in a fish tank. Therefore, even if it never gets another remake, Donovan's Brain will always be a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite brain-in-a-vat movie? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we definitely won't be disassembling anything, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Lay off, stop it. Ready for duty? Always ready. Yes, sir, Colonel.
Jan, put on some coffee.
Don't I always put a pot of coffee on the stove before I pass out?